I know that everybody's tired of hearing philosophical arguments and squawking and stuff, but this maybe is a different perspective, so I'm hoping you listen for a couple.
From the outside, Kristin Nelson had already lived the kind of life most people only dream about. She married into American television royalty, raised 4 children alongside a chart-topping rock star, and spent her final decades as a respected painter working out of a quiet studio in the high desert of New Mexico. But the woman who died alone in Santa Fe in 2018 had survived a marriage that collapsed in public, a plane crash that ended in tragedy, a custody battle that turned brother against sister, and years of addiction that nearly cost her everything, including her own son. This is the real story of Kristin Nelson, and of the 4 children who had to find their own way out of the wreckage she and their father left behind. On April 27, 2018, Kristin Nelson died of a sudden heart attack at her home in Santa Fe. She was 72 years old, and by that point, most of the world had forgotten who she once was. She wasn't a headline anymore. She was a painter, known locally for bright, folk art-style canvases sold through a small gallery, living a private life far from the cameras that had once followed her every move. Her oldest daughter, Tracy Nelson, broke the news publicly a few days later, describing her mother's death as sudden and unexpected. Those 2 words say more than they seem to. They tell you that no one around Kristin saw it coming, and that by the end of her life, she wasn't surrounded by the entourage or spotlight that usually follows people who were once as famous as she was. What most people didn't realize is that Kristin had spent the last 20 years of her life building a genuinely respected career as an artist. Working in a folk or primitive style often compared to Grandma Moses, her paintings hung in the homes of people like Jacqueline Kennedy, who bought one of her earliest works, a piece Kristin painted when she was barely out of her teens. Actress Mia Farrow, a childhood friend, collected her art. So did actress Tyne Daly and country singer Dwight Yoakam. In the 1970s, her oil paintings were already selling for thousands of dollars. In 1997, she released an autobiography built around her artwork, weaving together paintings, journal entries, and photographs that told the story of her life in her own words. A title inspired by something her father used to say whenever she did something unexpected as a child, that she was simply out of her mind. That description followed her from childhood all the way through the wildest years of her adult life. To understand how a teenage bride became a woman whose family was torn apart by addiction, grief, and a very public custody war, you have to go back to the marriage that made her famous in the first place. Kristin's husband, Eric Hilliard Nelson, known to the world as Ricky Nelson, grew up inside one of the strangest experiments in American entertainment. His parents, bandleader Ozzie Nelson and singer Harriet Hilliard, built a radio show around their real family that later moved to television, running for well over a decade. It blurred the line between a real household and a scripted one, presenting the Nelsons as the ideal American family, while the actual Nelsons lived their lives on camera in front of millions of viewers. Ricky became a teen idol almost by accident, first picking up a guitar as a teenager to impress a girl, then landing on the same record label as Elvis Presley. Within a year, he had 2 hit singles and was one of the most successful young recording artists in the country. But behind the image, biographers and family members have long described his father as a controlling figure who managed every part of his children's lives, including Ricky's music career, shaping it to fit the family's public image. Ricky Nelson was, at once, a genuinely talented musician who would go on to influence generations of roots rock and country artists, and a young man who had been packaged as a product before he was old enough to understand what was happening to him. Kristin married Ricky when she was only 17. She was stepping into a life that had already been scripted for someone else before she ever arrived. What followed looked, from a distance, like a fairy tale. Underneath, it was falling apart almost from the beginning. Years later, in a Candid magazine interview, Kristin described those early years honestly. 2 young people caught up in the culture of the era, trying to keep up with a touring rock star's lifestyle, both of them eventually overwhelmed by it. She said she tried joining Ricky on tour to save the marriage, tried to fit into a world that was pulling them apart instead of bringing them together. She sought therapy. For a while, so did he, until he stopped showing up. When she tried to tell her own family that substance abuse was tearing their marriage apart, she has said they refused to believe there was a problem at all. By the mid-1970s, the marriage was effectively over in every way but on paper. In 1977, while Ricky was away on tour, Kristin moved his belongings into a separate rented house. Weeks later, she reportedly found him there with 2 other women, a discovery Ricky would later claim had been staged to strengthen her position in the divorce. She filed for divorce that October, asking for custody of their children, financial support, and a share of what they had built together. The couple briefly reconciled, a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched a marriage die slowly rather than all at once. In a decision that stunned people close to them, they even bought the former Mulholland Drive estate of actor Errol Flynn in 1980, despite a marriage that was already in ruins and finances that were already strained. Kristin filed for divorce again later that same year, and this time it stuck. The proceedings dragged on for 2 years, cost well over $1 million in legal fees, and were tracked closely by the California press. When the divorce was finalized at the end of 1982, both of them came out of it financially damaged. Kristin later said her devoutly Catholic family blamed her entirely for the divorce and never forgave her, not for ending the marriage, and not for failing to be the perfect wife and mother they expected. The divorce had already broken the family apart. What happened 3 years later would make everything before it looked like only the opening chapter. On New Year's Eve, 1985, Ricky Nelson, then 45, was flying with his band and his fiancée to a concert in Dallas aboard a converted World War II-era DC-3, an aircraft with a history of mechanical issues that Ricky had purchased earlier that year and never properly registered with federal aviation authorities. Not long after takeoff, the pilot radioed air traffic control to report a problem and requested to turn back. Minutes later came a second, more urgent transmission: smoke in the cockpit. Shortly after that, the plane vanished from radar. Witnesses on the ground near a small Texas town watched it descend in flames before it clipped power lines and crashed into a rural field. The pilot and co-pilot managed to escape through the cockpit windows, badly burned. Everyone else on board, Ricky Nelson, his fiancée, and all 5 members of his band, died in the crash. Investigators spent roughly a year and a half examining the wreckage. Early rumors, fueled by preliminary toxicology findings, suggested substance use might have sparked the fire. The final federal investigation instead pointed to a faulty cabin heater as the most likely cause, and found no evidence that substance use played any role in the crash itself. But the rumors never fully went away, and they caused lasting pain for the children who were left to process the loss of their father under a cloud of public speculation. Kristin was 40 years old when she got the news. She and Ricky had already been divorced for 3 years, but his death closed off any chance of the kind of peace divorced parents sometimes eventually find. Their children were now truly fatherless, and whatever bitterness remained between Kristin and Ricky's side of the family had nowhere left to go but deeper. The funeral itself became another public wound. By multiple accounts, a heated and physical argument broke out between Kristin and her eldest daughter, Tracy, in the middle of the service, a private family collapse that instead became part of the public record. Kristin later approached Ricky's brother, who was managing the estate, hoping for a share of the life insurance and assets. A judge denied her claim. Everything that remained went to the 4 children. Kristin, who had spent more than half her life tied to Ricky Nelson, walked away from his death with nothing. She was 40, freshly widowed in every sense, but the legal one, broke, grieving, and already struggling with addiction, conditions that were about to collide with the life of her youngest child in a way that would split the family wide open. Sam Nelson, born in 1974, was the youngest of Kristin and Ricky's 4 children, and by most accounts the one who absorbed the deepest damage from everything that came before him. He was 6 when his parents' final divorce proceedings began, 8 when it was finalized, and 11 when his father died in a burning plane on New Year's Eve. In the years surrounding all of this, he was shuffled between relatives, first his aunt, then his grandparents for a year and a half, then his uncle, actor Mark Harmon, and Mark's wife, actress Pam Dauber. By the time Sam was a teenager, he had lived under the roofs of several different adults, none of whom offered anything close to stability. Meanwhile, the addiction that had quietly undermined Kristin's marriage hadn't disappeared after the divorce. It had gotten worse. She has admitted openly that during those years she drank heavily and used substances, to the point that she was often too impaired to paint, which had always been the one part of her life that was entirely her own. She took a job as an assistant casting director, simply to stay afloat financially. One of the twins later described those years bluntly, recalling that their mother's heavy drinking began even before the divorce, that she attended AA meetings, and that the family endured drunken arguments none of them would ever forget. After Ricky's death, things deteriorated further. Kristin's behavior grew increasingly unpredictable, and Sam, still just a child, bore the brunt of it. At 12 years old, he picked up the phone and called his Uncle Mark. According to his aunt, Sam begged to be taken out of the house, saying he couldn't take it anymore and describing his mother's moods as constantly swinging between highs and lows, unpredictable as weather. That is not the language of a minor disagreement. That is a child asking to be rescued. Not long after, Mark encountered Kristin in a grocery store and believed she appeared intoxicated, something Kristin has always denied, insisting she was simply worn down and exhausted. Regardless, Mark convinced his sister to check into a rehabilitation program in Los Angeles. Kristin later said that her brother was the only person who could have talked her into treatment, because he was the one person she truly trusted. She completed the 30-day program and came out of it proud of what she had accomplished. On the very day she was released, she learned that Mark and Pam had filed for permanent custody of Sam. She has said she initially thought it had to be a joke. The custody hearing that followed was brutal. Sam's own psychiatrist testified that the 13-year-old described his mother in frightening terms, not as someone strong, but as something dangerous and unpredictable, and said her mood swings terrified him and kept him from seeing his siblings. Kristin fought back by publicly alleging that Pam had a substance problem of her own, a claim that shifted the tone of the proceedings. Eventually, attorneys on both sides agreed the conflict had gone far enough. Mark withdrew the full custody petition. The final arrangement left Sam in his mother's custody, granted Mark visitation rights, required the family to attend therapy together, and ordered Kristin to stay a significant distance away from Mark and Pam's home and workplace. The family survived the custody battle. But survival and healing are not the same thing, and while Kristin was fighting to keep her son, her eldest daughter was sitting in a doctor's office receiving news that would connect this family's turmoil to her own body in the most frightening way imaginable. What Kristin and Ricky Nelson's marriage ultimately produced wasn't measured in album sales or magazine covers. It was measured in the 4 children who had to carry the weight of everything that happened and somehow build lives of their own. Tracy Nelson, born in October 1963, just months after the wedding, inherited the intensity of both of her parents. She was acting before she could read, training as a dancer for 17 years, and eventually built a substantial television career, including a well-known role as a nun-turned detective in a long-running mystery series. But behind every professional milestone, Tracy carried the accumulated weight of her family's collapse. 5 months after marrying actor William Moses in 1987, at just 24, she was diagnosed with stage 2 Hodgkin's lymphoma. She underwent major surgery that removed her spleen, part of her liver, and left her with a scar spanning more than a foot across her body. She has said she believes the extraordinary stress of her father's death and the custody war happening around the same time contributed to the disease. She went into remission, but cancer wasn't finished with her. In 2005, she was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, likely a delayed effect of her earlier radiation treatment. In 2010, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She survived all 3 diagnoses, underwent a double mastectomy and reconstruction, and became an outspoken advocate for cancer research. Her marriage to Moses ended after a decade, and she went on to raise 2 children of her own. The twins, Gunnar and Matthew Nelson, born in September 1967, lost their father at 18, only months after moving in with him. Despite everything complicated in their parents' history, they were devoted to Ricky as both a father and a musician, and after his death they made a deliberate choice to carry his legacy forward through their own band. Their debut album went double platinum, and their biggest single became a #1 hit, making them, alongside their father's own #1 record decades earlier, part of an extraordinary 3-generation family record. going back to their grandparents' own chart-topping success on television and radio. They've continued performing for decades, including tribute shows honoring their father, and run their own independent record label. And then there's Sam, the youngest, the one who absorbed the most direct damage, the boy who once described his own mother as something to fear. He went on to earn a degree in psychology, formed his own band, and on the 30th anniversary of his father's death released a tribute album built from his father's music and memory. He has spoken about how surreal it felt to lose his father at 11, having seen him alive just days earlier at Christmas, and how the loss left him unmoored for years before he found something steadying in the music and photographs his father left behind. He eventually became one of the people managing his father's estate, and in later interviews, has spoken with a kind of hard-won peace, that with age, many of the things that once felt unbearable stop feeling that way, that you either work through your problems or you don't, but you try. He has said that he and his mother eventually built a genuinely good relationship. All 4 children survived what their parents' marriage produced. But the woman who brought them into that world still had one chapter left to write for herself. In 1988, a year after the custody battle over Sam, Kristin remarried, this time to television producer and director Mark Tinker, a serious professional in his own right rather than someone famous by association. Early in their relationship, he reportedly asked her a simple question that almost no one in her life had ever asked her before. What did she actually want to do with her life? Her answer was immediate. She wanted to paint. What most people never realized is that Kristin had been painting since she was a teenager, long before any of the chaos that would come to define her public image. She held her first solo art exhibition in 1967, when she was in her early 20s, years before the addiction, before the divorces, before the custody battles and the crash. The painting never stopped. Even during her worst years, when she has said she was too impaired to work consistently, the art remained the one part of her identity that nobody else could claim, package, or control. Kristin and Mark Tinker divorced in 2000 after 12 years of marriage. Afterward, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She moved permanently to Santa Fe, New Mexico. She had first visited the state decades earlier while touring with Ricky, and had fallen so completely in love with the region that she never wanted to leave. It took her another 30 years to actually make that move permanent, but once she did, she never left again. In a documentary about the Nelson family made in the late 1990s, Kristin described her life in terms that summed up everything that came before. She said she had spent her entire life fighting against the fairy tale, first trying desperately to live inside it, and then trying to tell the truth about what it had actually cost her. That fairy tale had a very specific address, a television set that ran for over a decade, a Mulholland Drive mansion once owned by a Hollywood legend, a Catholic church where a teenage bride married a rock star while the country watched. The truth had a different address entirely. One built from addiction, from 2 divorces, from a funeral that ended in a physical fight, from a judge who ruled she deserved nothing from her ex-husband's estate, and from a rehabilitation stay that saved her life even as it cost her custody of her youngest son. And then there was the final chapter, quieter than all the others. Kristin Nelson, alone in a Santa Fe studio, painting canvases that collectors wanted, writing the kind of poetry and memoir that let her tell her own story on her own terms for the first time. Not every relationship in her life healed. Things with her brother Mark remained complicated for years after the custody fight. But her bond with Sam grew stronger over time. Tracy had beaten cancer 3 separate times and built a career and a family of her own. The twins were still performing, still honoring their father's memory through music. The family never reached anything close to a perfect resolution, but it reached something real. When Kristin Nelson died in her Santa Fe home on April 27, 2018, at 72 years old, she had spent 55 years running from a fairy tale that the entire country had once watched her step into as a teenager. She never fully escaped its shadow, but she never stopped trying to build something real underneath it, either. And, in the end, in her own house, doing work that belonged entirely to her, she finally got to live life on her own terms. For a woman whose story had for so long been written by other people, her father's athletic fame, her brother's television career, her husband's rock stardom, and his devastating death, that quiet final chapter in the desert was the one chapter that was completely, unmistakably hers. It's tempting to read Kristin Nelson's life as a cautionary tale, a warning about what fame does to families that get swallowed by it too young. There's truth in that reading, but it misses something important about how the story actually ended. Kristin was 17 when she stepped into a marriage that had already been shaped by other people's expectations. A husband whose identity had been built